Hello, witchy people. You may be wondering why I'm sat here in the dark with nothing but a cup of coffee, a solitary lit candle, and a snoring dog to keep me company. Well, many years ago, I used to run a website called The Haunted ChaCha. And on that site, I would write down the tales that people had told me, not necessarily ghost stories, just tales of strange happenings, weird goings on in strange places, eerie places, places that were supposedly haunted, maybe. So if you want to hear a few, grab a cup of coffee, sit down, and I'll tell you some. The house that drove people mad. It was a house like any other council house on the estate. It was a bit drab, very unexciting to the outsider, though many people wish they could live there because it was, and still is in fact, an end of terrace with a bigger garden than most. It was, for a small time, my house. Well, my parents lived there, and as I was their child, I lived there too. I must have been no more than a year old when my mum and dad were lucky enough to be offered this big house to live in. We weren't the first people to live there. The house was about 30 years old. But it was our first family house. Mum, Dad, my brother and I. Of course, I don't recall very much at all, but the stories the family told and what happened to other families who lived there before us, well, they were quite frightening. The residents before us had been a happy family. Their daughter had left home to be married, and they had just begun to settle into living life alone, awaiting news of when they would be grandparents. That's why they stayed in that house, so it would be big enough for when their future grandchildren wanted to come visit. Then one day, their idyllic, quiet life was shattered. The husband came home one day after work, lay down on the sofa after taking an overdose of tablets, and died. The wife took her husband's death badly and slowly went mad. The daughter they both loved so much died shortly afterwards, so the story is told, though how she died, I don't know. The neighbours warned my mum and dad, it's unlucky to move in a house where someone has died. But in all honesty, there was a feeling when you walked in the door, a welcome feeling of coming home. At least, that's how it was for a little while. It was my dad's early mornings that made my mum realise she wasn't always alone. Dad would leave for work very early, 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and that was when my mum would hear the voice and the footsteps. A light footfall round the bed, and a whisper that was barely audible over her breathing. Shh, don't wake her. Mum would bury her head under the bedclothes and wait until the footsteps and the whispers went away. She knew, just knew, that it was a man whispering to his 2 children. Sometimes the fear would just be too much, and Mum would ask her friend Sheila to come and stay the night, so that she wouldn't be alone in the mornings. Or when Sheila's husband and my dad would have a night out without the wives, she'd ask her to stay then too. Some nights would be awful. The electricity would cut in and out, and my brother and I would be screaming upstairs while Sheila and my mum would be frantically trying to reach us, unable to actually get up the stairs. One night my granddad offered to babysit for my brother and I, so my mum and dad could go out on their own for a while. He dismissed the idea that the house was haunted as poppycock, and "What nonsense," said he. When Mum and Dad arrived home later that evening, my granddad left the house, refusing to stay the night. He never told anyone exactly what happened, but he vowed never to go into that house again. When the radio started switching itself on and off, and anything placed on the mantelpiece above the fire was moved by an unseen hand, it was time for my family to go. My brother and I screamed every night. Mum couldn't rest, and Dad was trying to pretend nothing unusual was really happening. So we went to another house and left the unrested spirits alone once again. Several years later, whilst at school, I made friends with a girl who lived not far from my new house, though I had lived there by a good 10 years at the time. Charlotte told me an amazing story of her room being haunted. I listened avidly as she told me of a man and 2 children who walked around her bed at night. She spoke of how the television would be turned on or the channel changed, even though no one was near the television at that time, and, well, we didn't have remote controls back then. I just had to know if she lived in my old home. And when I asked her if the address was the one I had just told was hers, the answer was yes. Charlotte was never believed about the ghosts in her home, and she was driven crazy. I didn't see Charlotte for a long time and bumped into her again when we were about 16 years old. She claims that the ghosts and the fact that no one believed her, well, they were the cause of her having a mental breakdown. She will never visit that house again. Her father died while she was away having treatment for her breakdown. He died on the sofa, unexpectedly. Her mother was never quite the same afterwards. She never got over her husband's death and moved out of that house, the cursed house, as she called it, shortly afterwards. No one in that family would sleep in what had been Charlotte's room, even though it was the largest bedroom in the house. According to neighbours, the family that lived in the house straight after Charlotte's family had lived there didn't stay long at all. Apparently it was a young family that moved into the house, but the wife was taken to hospital suffering a mental breakdown, and they left and never returned. I had to see the house again. So, in April 2004, I took a trip down memory lane and went back to the estate where I grew up. I drove past the house that I spent so little time in, and it looked exactly the same. There were a group of teenagers in the front garden building a bike, and smaller children were playing near the house. Everyone looked happy there. As I looked up towards the window of the room, I noticed it had no curtains up, even though every other window had beautiful ornate window dressings. Every window to a room that I could see looked bright and lived in, except the window of the bedroom where the man and the 2 children walked quietly round the bed. That window was dark and empty. I couldn't bring myself to go nearer and knock on the door. My curiosity was killed by a nervous fear of that window and what may lay inside. One question that does gnaw at me sometimes is why my family was spared. We all came out of that house unscathed. Maybe it was the short time we spent in the house. We lived there barely 6 months. I don't think I'll be going back to discover the reason why. I'd rather put up with the unanswered question.